Welcome to Austin Faith Dialogue. Today we're talking with two local citizens about a report that a governor's task force put together a year ago describing how churches and the government might cooperate in social services. It's faith in action. Stay with us for Austin Faith Dialogue.
Austin Faith Dialogue, at the crossroads of religion and life. A series highlighting the cultural and social interactions between the worshiping and religious communities in and around the capital city. Austin Faith Dialogue is brought to you by the Austin Metropolitan Ministries in cooperation with KXAN. Join us now in Austin Faith Dialogue.
We're glad you joined us for Austin Faith Dialogue. I'm Sandy Wilder, your host, and our guests today are, first of all, Fred Lewis, a local citizen, and Reverend Kobe Shorter from Rosewood Avenue Baptist Church. Good to have you guys. Thank you for being here. What we're talking about is this document, Faith in Action, a new vision for church-state cooperation in Texas, talking about the creation of the document, differing opinions about it. Let's get citizens interested in it today. And Reverend Shorter, I know you were on the group that helped develop this. Could you talk a little bit about how the document came to be, some of the issues you discussed? Describe the process.
Certainly. 16 citizens from throughout the state of Texas that have come from a variety of different religious backgrounds and or faith-based programs providing services to our state. Were asked convened by Governor Bush to come into Austin and other areas of the state and work to create dialogue in how faith-based programs are doing in terms of providing services and what type of intervention the government, particularly state government, has that may impede the progress of faith-based programs as they do their jobs. This whole process came into being because the governor was made aware that there were individual faith-based programs throughout the state in the process of doing their holistic approach in terms of providing for the needs of individuals and doing their running their programs. Ran up against brick walls in terms of government red tape, bureaucracy, even though they had proven results and compliance, results from a spiritual standpoint or a faith-based standpoint versus compliance from a government standpoint clashed. So with that in mind, the governor asked us to come in, hear what other citizens throughout the state, faith-based programs, and also the state government had to say, and provide advice to him in terms of what could be done in terms of some potential solutions. Never was it the intention of the governor nor the task force for the faith-based programs to replace the government in providing services. However, this was a mechanism by which we could see how both the faith-based programs and the government could peacefully coexist and provide services for individuals that really need them.
And I assume that you didn't volunteer, but you were asked to serve on this group. And so I wonder what was particularly appealing for you about the work of this group? I know pastors are busy. Why did you make time for this?
I made time for this because I believe in it. In addition to my responsibilities as a pastor of a local church here, the Rosewood Church, I also serve as a board member of a residential treatment center in our state. In that particular setting, there are a lot of rules and regulations that we all have to abide by, and no one's saying that we should not abide by those rules and regulations. However, sometimes some of those rules and regulations, whereas they may not affect the outcome or they may not actually generate a difference in the outcome, they can be hindering to the process of providing quality care. So as I'm familiar with it from a regulatory standpoint, but also as a pastor and of a church in this community, I feel that we have a spiritual command to provide services, and not to replace the government. But I also recognize that before the government was actually providing these services, the church was there. And we as a church community want to make sure that as we continue with the economic problems that we have, the healthcare problems that we have, providing child care, even in our community, that the faith-based community, no matter what the denomination or what faith you may be, you can effectively administer your programs without the government impeding your progress.
So it's a real call to us who are people of faith to get involved. And Reverend Mr. Lewis.
No one's ever called me that before.
Okay, you didn't hear it first here. Mr. Lewis, the report came out, or at least this executive summary, about a year ago, and you at least have read through it and have wrestled with some of the concepts. As an ordinary citizen and someone who wasn't involved in the drafting of it, how do you find this document? How did it strike you as an attempt, a first attempt, to get government and faith groups talking about their mutual responsibilities?
My concern about it is that I thought there was a political agenda to the report, and I did not think it had what I thought was the traditional understanding of the proper role for the state and religion. I've been involved in social services in helping in the community for a long time. And in fact, I'm one of the representatives to the Community Action Network, which is the local coordinating body in Travis County for social services. And I'm on the board of Austin Metropolitan Ministries, which provides social services to people in our community. But my idea of how we should provide for our citizens and the role for the government and the role for the faith community is not what I read in this document.
So if you were going to, say, have been a part of this group, what might you have said to the folks who were creating the document? What would you have encouraged them to leave in, to take out, based on your understanding of the issues?
This is the sort of things that got me upset about the report. There was a suggestion that prisons should be run by churches. Didn't seem appropriate to me. That we should have government funding and tax credits for economic development programs by religious groups. That doesn't seem like a proper role for religion to me. We should have exemptions from licensing for religious drug counselors. We should have exemptions for religious child care from licensing. And we should have exemptions from government contract regulations for religious social service providers. It seemed to me that if there were problems with particular government regulations, particular licensing, let's change that. But I did not see why a particular program, a religious program, should be exempt from something like ensuring that the person who's providing drug counseling has an understanding of addiction. And if someone wants to go to such a drug counselor, I think the person shouldn't be described as a drug counselor if they have no addiction training. And I think that the government shouldn't pay for it.
What about the whole notion that the government and faith-based groups work together? What about that whole foundation for the report? Do you see that as a helpful thing, or for you is that a boundary that shouldn't be crossed?
I think there's a boundary, but I think the report crosses it. I think the way I would describe the report's premise, it's that the government should be benevolently neutral towards religion. The problem is that benevolent and neutral are contradictory. You're either favorable or you're neutral. You can't be both. And I think the real purpose of the report is to provide funding and tax exemptions and licensing and regulation exemptions for religious-based programs. And I think that is going to result in excessive entanglement between the church and state, and ultimately will be bad for the government and, even worse, bad for religion.
And my hunch is there would be people who would agree, but also people who would disagree with what you see as written here.
Sure.
And so I went to Reverend Shorter, as a pastor, someone who worked on this and someone involved in social services, what effect have you seen from this report coming out? Are people, is it making a difference, in other words, in the way that
Definitely.
government and faith-based groups are working?
Definitely. One of the things that it's doing is causing people like myself and Mr. Lewis to come together on shows like this and create a dialogue. We are seeing some attention to the report nationwide. We're also seeing some attention to the report in terms of the legislature here in Texas. But I do want to respond to one of the things that Mr. Lewis did say, that there was nothing political about us coming together. There's nothing political about young people being hungry. There's nothing political about crime. There's nothing political about elderly care. There's nothing political about the faith-based community being concerned about criminals or those within the criminal justice system not just being run through the system. And from our standpoint, we're concerned about them being changed, real rehabilitation. And we say that you can't put a political agenda on helping those who need help. And all of us that were participants in this process, yes, most of us have a faith-based background. And we would love to have the opportunity to do more as it relates to faith-based programs. But one of the interesting things that came out of the report, and those individuals that were there, a lot of them have programs, and none of those people who were part of those programs, we never really said, hey, we want government money. What we did say was, we want the government to allow us to do what we feel like we are spiritually capable of doing. That the money does not drive the faith-based community. What does drive it is the capacity to help those who are hurting. And that is the way we approached it. We did not approach it from the standpoint of, well, allow us to have the capacity to receive funds, because what you will notice is that most of those individuals, well, all of those individuals that participated are doing what they're doing without the funding now. There's not a need for it, because we believe in the faith-based community, we can carry our own.
Or some days there's such a huge need, it's hard to meet it all. Now, did you find in your work that other states have had this same kind of dialogue? And if so, what conclusions did they reach about how the government and faith-based groups might work?
Several other states, Florida, Alabama, North Carolina, South Carolina, have looked at this, and there are accreditation mechanisms in place. Mr. Lewis mentioned that the report was heading us toward no licensing, no regulations. Many of the accrediting bodies, accreditation bodies that exist have standards that are higher than the state standards. And as we looked at that, no one's saying that faith-based programs should not have a level of accountability. We all think that we should be accountable because you're dealing with individuals and you're dealing with lives. But what we do say that is where those faith-based programs have the capacity to be accredited by bodies where the standards are greater than the standards that the state allows, the state should not come in and put undue burdens on that facility for when they already comply, or in many cases supersede what is already being asked.
Okay, a good start on our dialogue here. We'll come back for the second half of our conversation in just a minute, and we hope that you will stay with us also for the second half of Austin Faith Dialogue as we talk about faith in action. We're back for the second half of Austin Faith Dialogue, and we're talking about this document, Faith in Action, put out by a state task force about a year ago. And with us are Reverend Kobe Shorter from the Rosewood Avenue Baptist Church, one of the members of the task force that put the report together, and Fred Lewis, a local citizen who's read the report and has some questions about it. One of the issues that you wanted to talk about, Mr. Lewis, was the whole notion of licensing, and there is a section in here that talks about the government's approach to regulating faith-based groups. Anything in particular you'd like to point to?
Sure. What bothers me is there is a recommendation or recommendations in here that religious-based social service providers should be licensed through private accreditation, but that the state-based providers or non-faith-based private providers should be accredited through the state. And my problem with that is that I think if we want to have a dialogue about whether the public or private accreditation is better, that's one thing. But we shouldn't have separate accreditation processes for one or the other. The other thing I don't understand is that the argument made by those who favor private accreditation is that the standards are higher, okay, and therefore it's a better thing. On the other hand, they claim that the reason they don't want to comply with the state standards is they're too much of a burden. And I can't understand how, if the state requirements are such a burden, then it's even less of a burden to meet the higher standards. It would seem to me that if the higher standard, that if what you want is higher standards, they're more of a burden, not less. So I guess I think that a lot of the stuff written about the government impeding the ability to provide social services for faith-based providers is anecdotal. I haven't seen anything in the work that I've done in the community, faith-based work, that suggests that any of our work is being impeded. But one thing we're not trying to do in the groups I'm in, we're trying to help people and provide services to them. We are not trying to change their religious beliefs or inculcate their religious beliefs. What we're interested in doing is helping them. And my personal opinion is I'll leave their concerns about their spirituality and their soul to them.
And you are, I know, involved in community ministries. Are you involved in ministries where the work does bump up against government regulations or policies? And if so, what's the experience been about how you work that through?
We have government regulations that we have to deal with, and we have the same problems other people do, but they're not based, they have nothing to do with the fact that the people that I'm joining with are from an interfaith group. We don't have a problem because of whatever our religious background is. We have whatever problems people tend to have with government. Sometimes they're bureaucratic, sometimes they're not efficient, sometimes they don't listen as much as we'd like. And I've certainly had my share of frustrations. But the problem doesn't relate to the nature of our organization.
Okay. And another question, I know from conversation with you that you come from a Jewish background, and Jewish people are in the numerical minority in our state. I wonder if for you then, as a person of a minority faith, there were particular problems or concerns as you approach the whole notion of faith in action.
Being a member of a religious minority in the United States, I think I'm particularly sensitive to the fact that this notion of promoting church-state cooperation starts off with this notion of promoting church cooperation. Synagogue is not a church, and there are many other types of congregations that are not churches. And it shows you right there that the notion is to promote a certain type of idealized notion of religion. But we don't live in that type of world anymore. We live in a world with very different ideas of religion than 100 years ago. There are Sufis and Hindus and all sorts of people who don't fit this standard notion of the small town church providing social services for people. And I think that's one of the problems in this report, is it doesn't understand the problem getting the government involved with religion in a very pluralistic and diverse religious community.
So perhaps just the choice of language itself implies some things as you read it from a minority viewpoint.
Well, I was reading the quotes in here and looking at them today, and there were a few quotes from sort of obligatory quotes from people of different religions, but basically it was the whole Judeo-Christian background. I saw no quotes from Buddhists or other people of faith, and there are hundreds of millions of Buddhists in the world. And I don't see quotes from Hindus or Muslims, and there are more Muslims in the United States than Presbyterians, but I didn't see any quotes from Muslims, and it makes one wonder what exactly it is this report's trying to promote.
Okay, let me follow up on that then with you, Reverend Shorter. There is a list in the report of the persons who were on the task force here, the advisory task force, and hard to tell from the names, but I would assume that in the discussions, people of different backgrounds were included and different viewpoints were included. How did you approach that, since it is a new day in religious pluralism?
Certainly. We recognize that it is a new day in the world. We recognize there are people of different faiths, and we were very cognizant of that. On the committee, there were people of different backgrounds. There were people of Jewish descent and that were part of the discussions, and we were very, in terms of working together, we all worked very diligently. I think we can, I understand Mr. Lewis is concerned about the word church, but as we looked at that particular word, we looked at it from the standpoint of a faith-based community, whether you are Jewish, whether you are Buddhist, or whether you are Baptist, whether you are Catholic, and as we deliberated with representatives of some of those religions there, that issue in terms of that word, the word church, in terms of how Mr. Lewis presented it here today, that issue did not come up. Had Mr. Lewis been a part of the process, which was open to the public, some of the groups that Mr. Lewis works with were represented there. Had that idea been put forth as we presented the report, we would have taken that into consideration. We felt that since we did have people of various ethnicities, of various religions that were actually a part of the process, and this report had to be approved by the members of the process, that I think we were so focused on here's an opportunity for faith-based programs to actually have an opportunity to tell you what their concerns are, that semantics of language in some cases, in this particular case, was not considered. As we look at some of the regulations, we have never said, and nor will we ever say, that we do not want to adhere to regulations. But some of the regulations, which we could be here all day talking about them. Some of the regulations that some of the programs that were being faced with being shut down, even though they had proven results, Victory Fellowship, Teen Challenge, proven results. The results didn't matter. It was a matter of did you comply with having a 34-inch door versus a 36-inch door. And I think when someone's hurting, the size of a door is one of the least things that we want to be concerned about if it's not a safety issue. If it is a safety issue, it needs to be addressed. And those are the type of the major legislative or major regulatory issues, yes, we should abide by them. But those that even are burdensome to those who are not faith-based, this should be addressed. And what this whole process does, it brings to light that faith-based community is not the only one being adversely affected by these regulations. Anyone involved in service provision is being affected.
And you talked about the process as you were doing the work in committee as being an open process. So what now? Is this finished? Is there further work of the task force, or what happens now?
The task force has completed its charge. We wish we had had more time, because you can never exhaust. If we had the mechanisms to solve all the world's problems, we wouldn't be here today talking about a faith dialogue, but we don't. This is the beginning, and the governor saw this as an opportunity to create dialogue. This report is not gospel. It is an opportunity to create a dialogue and say, here's a perspective of 16 individuals who are from various denominations, various religions. Here's our opinion. We recognize that there are other opinions, but at least for the first time in our state's history, we are having what we call faith dialogue.
A good first step. And so, Mr. Lewis, you have read it and have some problems with some parts. Would you scrap it? What would you do?
If it were me, I would rework this report to better reflect the idea that there's a very pluralistic religious tradition in this country, and that we need to while we need to promote the social welfare and we need to have cooperation between the state and religious organizations and serving the needs, collaboration, that we cannot cross the line where the state and the religious community get excessively entangled, because it'll be to the detriment of the religious community and the state. I think that ultimately, if the state and the church, as we call it, get too entangled, we'll end up with chaos.
So, since you're involved in Austin Metropolitan Ministries, how might that local group wrestle with this?
Well, the way, as I understand it, the way we deal with it is the faith of all the different religious groups and religious people that belong animates us to help people in the community. But we don't proselytize our religious values on someone else. That I'm going to help someone regardless of whether they're religious or not religious, regardless of what their religion is. But I guess I feel secure enough in my own faith that I'm going to worry about my faith and let them worry about theirs.
Okay. And part of your concern, I know, is dialogue, is continuing to wrestle with this. So do you see that some group in town might really continue the conversation?
I think it's still going on, and I hope it still goes on, because I think there is a lot of common ground. I think it helps just having this dialogue to better understand each other's position.
Right. Okay, and Reverend Shorter, we have time for one more question, I believe. So as a task force member, what would you like to see Texans do with this?
I'd like to see Texans become aware that it does exist. I would like for Texans to know that as we went through this process, it was a very inclusive process. It was a process that, yes, we are trying to see how the faith-based community and the government can coexist. Mr. Lewis mentioned crossing lines. When you pastor in a community where you see people hurting, where you see people in need, the government isn't necessarily right there, but the church is. And when we want to help someone, we don't want to be faced with undue and unnecessary regulations in feeding the hungry, providing care for the elderly, and providing examples for our youth, because there are some very serious issues that are occurring in our country. And if we sit around and we debate and dialogue too much, we could end up losing a generation, and we need to be very concerned about that, because there's a lot of work out there to be done. And the faith-based community, we're not trying to make people Baptist, we're not trying to make them Catholic, we're trying to make them whole. And then in terms of that transcends whatever religion you may be.
There is a great deal still to do, and you all have identified the issues well. Thank you for being here. Check out Faith in Action and check out Austin Faith Dialogue next week.